research integrity event that's sponsored by the Office for Research Protections. And my name is Stephanie Romo, Education Coordinator for the ORP. So thanks for being here. You received 1 hour of SARI credit for attending this event today. And you and your graduate program administrator will receive an email from us letting you know that you attended the event so that credit can be given to you. So that usually takes between maybe 3 and 5 business days in order to get that email. But you will be notified as well as your program admin. As a courtesy to our speaker, if you could set your phones aside for the next hour, that would be greatly appreciated. Today, we are very fortunate to have Sarah Horn. She's the director of the IRB program at the Office for Research Protection. And Sarah leads and manages the day-to-day activities of the IRB program. She serves as a committee member on both IRBs and as a designated reviewer of the non-committee new study applications, modifications, and continuing reviews for the use of human participants in research, reportable new information, and non-human research determinations. So today's event is entitled IRB 201, NIH Single IRB Policy and Using the SMART IRB Agreement. And I wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded for purposes of Zoom so that other people from our Commonwealth campuses can join us. So please help me welcome Sarah Horn.
Thanks, Deb. So as Deb mentioned, I am the IRB director here at our University Park campus. And just for reference, our IRB office oversees research that is happening at all colleges and campuses at Penn State except for the College of Medicine and Hershey Medical Center, including those local Hershey Medical Center regional campus locations as well. So they do have a separate IRB, but we do work closely with them. But just to frame our talk today and let you know that. So I'm going to start by asking a question because I'm not sure exactly who we have in the audience today. So could you, by show of hands, let me know how many of you have experience in conducting human subjects research? Maybe you're working on a project with faculty advisor or conducting your own project. Anybody? Okay. So some of this is going to be brand new to you. So as I move through, feel free to ask questions. And today's session is not a basics on the institutional review board by any means. And so I will try, knowing that much of the audience doesn't have as much experience in that area, I will try to stop and sort of explain those things as we go and help fill in the gaps for you. But hopefully this doesn't go too far above what you might know. Okay, now I lost this step. Did test it. No, it's just my clicker is now.
But you might need to just click the next space, like click on the presentation itself one.
Okay, perfect. I should. Okay, so a couple terms so that we can set the stage for this conversation that you'll need to know is first and foremost single IRB. And so a single IRB review is the actual legal arrangement that allows one IRB. So each institution typically has its own IRB. Each medical center that's participating in the site might have its own IRB. There are also what we call commercially available IRBs. So those are IRBs that are not directly linked to a particular institution. And for those of you who may not be familiar but are still coming to this session to hopefully learn more about this and to earn your credits as well, the Institutional Review Board is responsible for the ethical review and regulatory review of human subjects research. So that's the breadth of what we cover. So we obviously then don't cover things like animal research or research with other materials that are not human. And so each institution typically has their own IRB. So this single IRB review is that legal arrangement that allows for one IRB to serve in the capacity as a reviewing entity for other IRBs or other sites that have IRBs. So the reviewing IRB or IRB of record is the actual IRB that provides, in this scenario, the ethical review and makes the necessary regulatory determinations. Okay, so the first part, single IRB, review was the legal arrangement that allows them to do that, to provide that ethical review. The relying IRB is the IRB that actually precedes or gives up IRB review responsibilities to that reviewing IRB. And then the reliance agreement is the physical document that outlines the responsibilities of each of those parties, the reviewing IRB and the relying IRB, so that each site understands what they need to do when they're participating in that reliance arrangement. So historically, many studies were conducted at single sites. Over time, as research has grown and accelerated and different areas of research have accelerated, we increasingly see studies that are conducted at multiple sites. And we're going to call that a multi-site study when we're talking through today's presentation. So they're working with investigators, maybe here at Penn State, often work with other investigators at other institutions, whether that be through a collaboratory nature or relationship, or in a multi-site study where we're each conducting the same protocol at our respective sites. And that shift to a multi-site setup really allows for research to move faster, allows researchers to increase their enrollment of participants quicker, which means that the faster these things happen and the more people that we can get enrolled in these studies, the more significant the results might be to the general public. And so it's really important that moving forward, more studies are conducted at multiple sites versus this conducting them in silos at each institution. So generally it takes quite a bit of time to move a sound research study from the point of conception or the point that a grant proposal is submitted or something like that to the point that the study begins, or the startup, if you will. There often can be lags because of several issues. So one of those issues is grants and contract negotiations or execution. So across the university, one thing that we commonly hear from people, not only in the IRB, but in other areas as well, is that, oh, it takes so long to get this contract worked out, or it takes so long to get this agreement that I need. And to get all of those multiple pieces in place really often delays the startup of a study. Again, multiple IRB reviews across each site. So that's kind of setting us up for our discussion today about why single IRB review is important and why we're moving this way across the country. So each IRB historically that was participating in one of those multi-site studies would review this study. And in an IRB review, we not only have to make those regulatory determinations that are required because we receive federal funding for the study, but we also conduct an ethical review. And so if you can imagine, this is what an IRB meeting looks like, okay? So you have probably anywhere from 5 to 15 faculty members and community members sitting in a room discussing a protocol. And of course, with 5 to 15 people from different backgrounds or disciplines, you have quite a variance in their interpretation of the regulations, their interpretation of ethics, in particular of conducting the type of study that they might be reviewing. And so if you imagine this, not only the variance in opinions at that level, but this is happening across all of those participating institutions in a study. And so from one site to the next, while IRB review should look very similar because the requirements for state law don't vary significantly, you'll often find that the IRB review looks very different, and that different IRBs have different things that they pinpoint in the review or that they're concerned about in the review. And so to get a study started up, a multi-site study started up, it goes through all of those reviews at all of those institutions and finally comes back to the point of study startup. And that could take weeks, it could take months, it could probably even take years depending on the circumstance, especially with things like international research. They tend to be fairly complicated reviews that might take quite some time. So again, IRBs play a critical role in reviewing and approving those studies because as part of the process, we're reviewing the potential benefits of the research versus the risk to the subjects. And so this is our primary concern, is protecting human subjects in the research. So we evaluate all of the risks in the research and all of the benefits of research. So where we're moving in the future. So I just discussed sort of where we came from with this multi-pronged review. And where we're moving in the future is single IRB review. So in particular, today we wanted to talk about the NIH single IRB review policy, as this is a new requirement that just went into effect on January 25th. And what this requires is that one IRB serve as the reviewing IRB with little exception. In the case where a study is, again, one of those true multi-site studies, so at each site where there's a participating investigator, or at each site where participants will be enrolled, the same protocol is being carried out. And what we mean by the same protocol here is the same methodologies, same collection of data, same data analysis, all of those things are being conducted at each of those sites. And this is a stark difference from the revisions to the common rule. So in some of our presentations recently, we've been talking about the common rule. If you're not familiar with IRBs, you're probably not familiar with the common rule. But just for a frame of reference, the common rule is a set of regulations that we use, again, when we're reviewing human subjects research. We have to determine that it meets these particular criteria for approval that are outlined in the regulations. And so in that process, again, we are ensuring that those have been met and that they're conducting the same protocol across sites. This new particular NIH policy for single IRB review seeks to end that duplicative model of review that tends to delay that study startup. So that common rule that I was talking to you about a minute ago has the new revisions to the common rule. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words here. There are some new revisions that will be coming in July, and those revisions include single IRB review for collaborative research. Multi-site research, again, was where the protocol is being conducted, the same protocol is being conducted at each site. And collaborative research is where there may be more than one participating institution or site, but they're not conducting the same exact protocol. So maybe, for an example, we're working with Penn State researchers or working with a researcher at Ohio State. Both of us are involved in the research. However, maybe at Ohio State, they're going to do some surveys and collect data that way. And maybe here at Penn State, we are collecting data by another means, like we're having somebody physically come into the lab and do something, and we're collecting data that way, run on a treadmill, collect blood, something like that. So since we're not doing the same thing at both sites, that particular policy for single IRB review for NIH does not apply. But the new common rule requirement will apply when that goes into effect later this year. And again, I won't go too much into that because I know that if you are not familiar with this policy, then that's probably much more than you need to know. So NIH grant applications from that point forward, from January 25th forward, generally, with few exceptions, have to identify a proposed single IRB, and they have to include a plan for communication between the sites regarding IRB review. So this is something that starts at the time that a grant is proposed or the grant application is submitted to NIH, sorry. And so that they include that single IRB plan as part of the submission. They indicate that this is subject to the single IRB policy. And then applicable participating domestic sites have to also indicate their support for that particular plan for single IRB review. So there are a few situations where that's not applicable, the policy is not applicable, but we won't go through that today. So one important takeaway about this whole process is that IRB review is really only one part of that study startup here at Penn State. Here on the screen, you'll see that I've listed just a few, and there are probably many more areas where there are other reviews that happen typically concurrent to the IRB review, and that need to happen before a study can begin here at our site or at a particular site. And so at the same time that the IRB is reviewing something, the Conflict of Interest Committee might also be reviewing that study or something related to that study. The study might also require institutional biosafety committee review if it involves the collection of human specimens or samples. You might have an FDA review going on at the same time. And so really, it's important to notice that in this model for single IRB review, the only thing that we'd be giving up to another IRB, to a reviewing IRB, is that ethical and regulatory review for human subjects. So the cost for single IRB review, unfortunately, because this is such a new requirement, the costs are really largely unknown at this time. Right now, we are working with some individuals here at Penn State with research accounting and whatnot to determine what appropriate costs for the activities that we would need to do above and beyond our typical review, and what we would need to charge for those particular activities. And so as we move forward and start practicing this, if you will, start serving in the role as a reviewing or relying IRB, we'll be able to better determine what those costs look like. And then we can advise individuals as to how to build those into their grant proposals. Investigators should be aware that other non-Penn State IRBs may have fees in place already that may need to be built into the budget if we are not serving as the single IRB here at Penn State. And also that the lead site and lead investigator are responsible for those fees, and that doesn't, move through the subcontracted site. So a reliance agreement or IRB authorization agreement, and again, we touched on what the definition of this was at the beginning. This is an actual physical contract between 2 or more sites that allows one institution's IRB to serve in the capacity and review for another IRB. This may be on a study-by-study basis, or maybe for a particular subset of studies or consortium of research. So we have a lot of colleagues across the country who are part of particular types of research consortiums, like a cancer trial network or traumatic brain injury network of researchers. And so in those networks, they tend to have a reviewing IRB for that particular network. And they might execute an agreement for that entire subset of studies. So the agreement, again, delineates the responsibilities between the sites. And as we'll see, and we're going to talk about one example of a master agreement, but master agreements are actually becoming a little bit more common than these individual agreements that are on a site-by-site or study-by-study basis. So some typical terms of a master agreement. So to join a master agreement, you typically have to meet certain criteria. And we're going to talk again about one particular type of master agreement today, which is called the SMART IRB agreement. So to join SMART IRB and to join many other master agreements, our Human Research Protections Plan, a program which includes our IRB program, had to go through a process of an independent assessment of our quality. And here at Penn State, we meet that particular criteria by going through the process for accreditation. Not every site is accredited, so there are other options to meet that quality assurance assessment requirement in most cases. We have to have the capability to do internal monitoring, which we do. We have a quality management program who does monitoring of studies after review. And then we have to possess a federal-wide assurance. And I won't get into the details about that, but that assurance, generally speaking, is the agreement that we have with the government saying, yes, we will follow or abide by these regulations if we receive federal funding. So there are some typical terms of a master IRB reliance agreement, and I think given the audience today, I think we should keep this discussion a little bit more high level, but essentially there are particular responsibilities that parties typically have in this type of scenario. So we'll talk about an example here, which is the SMART IRB agreement. So the nature of the SMART IRB agreement is that, again, it is one of those master agreements that we just touched on. And the SMART IRB agreement is written to cover funded and unfunded research. It's written to cover studies that involve just a few institutions, so maybe just 2 or 3, but it's also written so that it could accommodate studies that include 30 sites, 40 sites, 100 sites. It really is flexible in that way. It can also be used by single sites or institutions for those types of one-off studies, if you will, where you might want to see review. And it can also be reviewed or used by independent IRBs or commercial IRBs, as I referred to them earlier. So the advantage of the master agreement is that we've already signed on, and a lot of institutions, in fact, have already signed on to this agreement. So in the case that we decide to use the agreement, we don't have to go through this whole process again. This is one of those delays in the study startup, is getting these agreements in place. We've already had our legal counsel look at the agreement. We've already looked at the agreement. We've already agreed to the terms, and we've already determined that we meet the criteria. And so what we do when a situation or a particular study comes to us is we enact that agreement, if you will, or we decide that we're going to use that agreement in that case. So we don't need to have that additional documentation and go through that additional process. However, the agreement does need to, or the decision to use the agreement needs to be documented in each case. So just because we've signed on to Smart IRB does not mean that any investigator if they're planning a project together, again, maybe the example of somebody at Penn State and Ohio State, two institutions are planning to do a study together. That doesn't mean that they can just say, oh, we've already signed on to this agreement. The IRBs, again, need to physically make that determination that the Smart IRB agreement should be used in that case. And we need to document that. So Smart IRB, the aims of the project are really far beyond just this agreement. So it started with an agreement. It started with an idea that we could all come to this common set of terms that we could all agree upon and use to rely on one another. When you're talking about IRB review, again, there are those basic regulatory federal requirements. Some states have additional requirements for human subject research, and oftentimes when states do have particular requirements that pertain to research, they have many that pertain to it, but often you'll find that there are many states that don't have any additional requirements for research whatsoever. And Pennsylvania actually happens to be one of those states where we have laws that we might apply to research, or we've decided to apply to research, but we actually don't have many laws at a state level or local level that specifically apply to human research. And so we're really using those federal regulations and those ethical guidelines as the basis for our review. So we develop those common terms, and to do that within the Smart IRB agreement, they went through a long and arduous process of vetting this agreement. I think it's something like 18 pages at this point. And so they passed this through many institutions, many IRB representatives, many legal counsels, and came to a final decision. That doesn't mean that the agreement won't be amended at some point. It doesn't mean that it can't change. They do have SOPs and policies on how that agreement could be changed in the future, but again, they've come to some decision, and this is what IRBs at this point have signed on to. There are also other groups within the Smart IRB project that aim to, on a larger level, harmonize how IRBs do things. So again, remember that model I described to you where you're going to different IRBs for review and how those reviews differ, even though we're all following the same requirements? The Smart IRB project has larger aims to reduce those differences among those reviews. So we're coming up with common templates that people can use for protocols and for informed consent forms and things like that, common language that can be used, just commonalities in review requirements that we can, and standards that we have for review. And so it really is a much bigger effort. And these are just some of the pieces of that puzzle. So again, this kind of illustrates that the agreement is really just one piece of this whole project. So we have a whole set of groups of individuals who their main job is to help people understand this single IRB process, to start up this process, to get involved and get signed on to the agreement. We have the informatics team, which is really the IT support, if you will, for this whole project. So they've developed a whole platform that we can use for people to sign on to the agreement and to use the agreement. And then we have the SOPs, which are a set of documents that clearly outline the roles and responsibilities of the reviewing site and the relying site. And really, there's much more than this. On a weekly basis, my team, as well as others who are working with the Smart IRB project, are developing materials all the time to help support people through this process. So these are some of the key roles that are defined in the Smart IRB agreement in particular. So you got the point of contact, and that is typically the IRB representative, maybe the IRB director. So here at Penn State, this is me. And a lot of the communication about reliance arrangements goes through me, technically through the system. And then you have, again, the reviewing IRB, the relying IRB or relying institutions. You have the lead study team and overall PI. And then you have the local relying site study team or relying principal investigators or co-investigators if they could be. So there are a couple options when you're thinking about selecting a reviewing IRB. And again, I'm kind of going to keep this a little bit high level, but I would say the first piece of the puzzle here, and I unfortunately don't have this outlined on this slide, the first piece of the puzzle is contacting your IRB analyst. So if you have an idea for a project, if you have an idea for a grant proposal or an application, especially for NIH at this point, it's really important that you engage the IRB at a very early time. And that is no matter whether you're intending for us to serve as the IRB of record or we're just a relying IRB. A lot of investigators tend to think that it's a given that we can rely on another institution. And with the Smart IRB agreement, it is sort of a given in that we've all agreed to the same terms, and it's very likely that we could cede review to anybody else who is using the Smart IRB agreement. But it's not a given. Again, we make that decision on a case-by-case basis. And maybe, maybe an investigator will come to us and propose that we cede review for a study that is all happening here at our campus, involving our students or our faculty, and involves procedures that we're really familiar with, but they want somebody else to be the reviewing IRB. We might say, no, we don't agree to that. We want to actually be the reviewing IRB for that particular study. So when that single IRB plan is developed, again, particularly with regard to NIH studies, it's really important that we have a say in that and that we're engaged as early as possible. We can provide letters of support if they're needed for the proposal or grant application. There will be times, again, where we just cannot execute a reliance agreement for some reason at the time of grant proposal or application. So again, easier with the Smart IRB agreement, not quite as easy and not a given with other agreements or other scenarios. So again, I just want to reiterate that just because we've signed on to the agreement doesn't mean that any investigator can decide that we're using that agreement for a particular study or situation. So the role of the reviewing IRB. So we talked about how IRB was really just a piece of the larger puzzle for getting a study to start up and start enrolling. But this is really the place where the reviewing IRB has to provide the how. So they have to tell investigators at other sites how they want them to communicate information with them, because they are going to be responsible for that ethical and regulatory review. So when a modification needs to be made to a protocol, when they have something, let's say, somebody gets hurt unexpectedly, they need to know whether they need to report that to that reviewing IRB, and if so, how and in what time frame. So the reviewing IRB needs to make that information available. They need to have a mechanism for notifying relying institutions and investigators of decisions that are made, like approval of the study initially, approval of modification, of changes to the protocol, all those sort of things. So communication in this whole process is really key. Again, if I can paint this picture to further ingrain this for you, a lot of our investigators are very familiar with our IRB processes. And so here at Penn State, we have particular forms, we have an electronic system, And everybody who submits, I would say, more than once becomes really familiar with that process and really familiar with our policies and what we require. And now, if they enter in a situation where we're not the reviewing IRB, they have to now know how to do that for that other reviewing IRB. And that's not easy. So the role of the overall PI and the lead study team in this whole thing. So with this agreement, they place a lot of emphasis on the overall PI and the lead study team. So they sort of take on a lot of the role that our IRB would typically take on if this was just a 10-state study that we were reviewing. And so oftentimes the lead study team is actually at the institution that is serving as the reviewing IRB. So if we had a situation where an investigator got an NIH award and we are the lead study team and we're going to subcontract out to some other sites for certain work, oftentimes we then would serve as a single IRB. Now that is in question right now, and we're going to touch on that a little bit later as to whether we have the capability to serve as a single IRB right now. But oftentimes that's the case. So that overall PI assumes leadership. They understand that they have the ultimate responsibility for the conduct of the research. They're going to communicate information with the other sites. So essentially, they're going to hear from the reviewing IRB, and they're going to help communicate that information out. Vice versa, they're also going to collect information from sites to report back to the main IRB in many situations as well. So the role of the relying site. So oftentimes, unfortunately, the relying sites are kind of an afterthought in this whole process. So an investigator at the lead institution gets this idea for this multi-site study. They say, yeah, I want my IRB to be the IRB of record or reviewing IRB, and we're going to do this. And in fact, very early on after this policy went into effect, that was one of the first situations that we encountered. Jody and I got a call from an investigator who says, this is how we're doing this. And we said, wait. We need to be involved in this discussion, and we haven't yet made this decision. And so it's really important, again, that the relying site be involved in those conversations so that we can identify any roadblocks, so that we can help the investigators in developing that single IRB plan. Because again, it's not a given that we could seek review to another IRB. It's really important that they're engaged because they may have a larger understanding of what it may take to get a study up and going at their particular site. So obviously, again, we're really familiar with Penn State, really familiar with what it takes. And so involving us in that early stage can really help in the development of that plan and the protocol itself. So the role of the Human Research Protections Program, or HRPP, as I have written here, in this process. So again, the local IRB may still need to be involved in that review process and that whole, web of reviews that I showed you earlier, because there may be other requirements that need to be met at a particular institution or site before a study can begin, or before IRB approval can even be given. And so we can provide information to the reviewing IRB that they may need to do their job and carry out that review. So lastly, there are a lot of other, again, ancillary reviews that will happen at the same time that still need to be carried out here at Penn State. So an investigator here at Penn State would still technically submit to our IRB office, and we would do sort of an administrative review to ensure that all of those other needs are carried out before the study starts up. These are some of the responsibilities of a reliant institution. So we have the responsibility to ensure that staff are qualified to conduct the research, to ensure that the study teams are trained appropriately according to different policies and according to what they're doing on the study. We have a responsibility to ensure that those research teams at the local sites are complying with whatever the reviewing IRB has determined, and that they're following their protocols. We have a responsibility to notify the reviewing IRB if they require notification of particular events that may occur. And we have responsibility also to assist with any communications to federal agencies or to be responsive to audits if necessary of research studies. So the site PIs and the relying study teams, again, these are just some of the things that are important, but if the lead study team, again, is from an institution that is not their own, let me back up. If the lead study team is from an institution other than that of the reviewing IRB, then the roles and responsibilities that are listed here also apply to the study team at the reviewing IRB's institution. So they may take on some of that role of the overall PI or overall study team. So the point of contact, and again, I said at our institution, at our site, this would be me, but we serve as a local resource for the institution and local study teams as to what we need here when we're participating in a multi-site study. We help to determine whether we can actually service a reviewing IRB or seed IRB review, depending on the circumstance. And then we also help in communicating the decisions regarding some of those IRB reliance requests. So we handle a lot of that back and forth with the other IRB representatives at other institutions. So some advantages of the Smart IRB agreement. The Smart IRB can be used for any domestic study. Any institution who's participating can either serve as a reviewing IRB or can rely on another IRB if they've signed on to the agreement. Each institution still operates according to its own policies with regard to putting reliance in place. So each site may have their own requirements for when reliance is appropriate, and that's okay. Each site can maintain those requirements and decide on a case-by-case basis when the agreement should be used. Currently, there are 388 participating institutions. So I like to say we have 388 friends in this that are already signed on, who we can count on, if you will. And again, we've all agreed to those same terms, and so it just makes this whole process a little bit easier. So it provides that peace of mind, and that's kind of what I was just saying. We also can be assured that they met that quality assurance requirement, so we have less concern about their ability to carry out the study in an ethical manner and according to the requirements of the reviewing IRB. And then some of the disadvantages are, just obviously some of them are quite opposite from the advantages. So the agreement could only be used if other institutions are actually participating in Smart IRB. So if you want to use this in a situation where you know that the other institution has not yet signed on to Smart IRB, they can get in contact with their local ambassador for Smart IRB, and those are listed on the Smart IRB website. And that person can help them actually determine whether they can sign on to the agreement and then use the agreement in each particular situation. And so no changes, again, can be made to that master agreement without going through a whole formal process. That includes, reviewing and vetting of that those revisions by the participating institutions. So it's by no means fast and easy to make a revision. But again, hopefully with the process that's gone through so far with the vetting, hopefully we won't encounter many situations where revisions are really required. And then again, with a master agreement, investigators may think, ooh, I know about this Smart IRB thing, and they're part of this, and we're part of this, so we can just use this. And they may cut out the middleman, which is their local site or their local IRB. And I know I kind of emphasized it on the slide here, but it's like wrong, wrong, wrong. That couldn't be more wrong. Again, we make that decision on a case-by-case basis, and we have to document that decision as per the agreement. And so it's just not something that an investigator can do. So our position on single IRBs, we are supportive, and I don't have this on the slide, but we're supportive of the use of single IRBs. Again, obviously we want to contribute to faster start times for particular research studies. We want to decrease burden for investigators where possible. We may agree to serve on as a reviewing IRB on a limited or case-by-case basis, and that will all be dependent on some of the factors that are listed here. So whether we are the lead institution, we're receiving the funding, what the funding source is. So is it NIH or other federal funding, or is it not funded? The number of participating sites, so we may serve as the IRB record for something that involves 2 or 3 sites, but maybe not something that includes 100 sites right now. We don't typically, at our site, tend to be involved in those type of studies, but something could certainly come our way. And then depending on the level of risk of the study. So if the study is higher risk, we may want to review it on our own. We may want to seed review to another IRB, depending on the situation. We will generally seed review when it's necessary to follow the single IRB policy, but again, the decision is made on a case-by-case basis. And when the reviewing IRB is not accredited, or when we're not using the SMART IRB agreement, that's when we might run into situations where we might, that might come into question and we may not be able to seed review. So a couple of important takeaways, and I know you've heard me say this about 100 times throughout this presentation. This is all new to us, and certainly to those of you in the room, it's very, very new to you, and you may walk away and never use this information again. If you need to, it'll be here. Maybe someday down the line, you'll be doing human subject research and you'll say, ooh, an IRB. I know what an IRB is because I heard somebody speak about this one time. Regardless, for anybody who might be listening to this now or in the future who is planning on conducting multi-sited collaborative research, and this will apply, all of this right now is new, and it's new to you, it's new to us, and so we have to kind of give and take a little bit and understand that we're going to learn a lot in this process, and that it might not be easy in the beginning, but someday we will probably have this down pat, and it will be more common than our current scenario where we review each and every study on our own, essentially. Communication with all IRBs involved as early as possible is crucial. So again, at that time of grant proposal or grant application, or if the study's not funded, even at the time of conception, is really important. We are more than happy to be part of meetings with investigators, co-investigators, to advise on IRB requirements and to help determine whether a single IRB would be a model to use. The use of a SMART IRB agreement is preferred when we are going to seek review to an external IRB, or when we'll serve as a reviewing IRB, but not absolutely necessary. And there are a lot of changes that may be coming your way, and if you don't do human subject research, just things that you might need to know about. And all of those changes, again, are designed to improve protections and to reduce burden. We're not going to do anything that is contrary to those without good reason for doing so. Anything that we would do that would add work, we would see as increasing protections to human subjects and vice versa. Short timeline for implementation. So, you know, from the time that we found out about this policy to now, it's been a relatively short time, and again, is a relatively new concept for a lot of IRBs. And so again, we are learning along the way and learning from our colleagues and those sort of things. We have a lot of mechanisms for feedback on how to improve our process, our communications, and we certainly invite you all to share those thoughts and feedback with us. And I have those listed here. And I think we're just going to skip to the end because I had a few things on additional changes in case I had some people that this might apply to. But we're going to skip to the end, and I'm going to leave a couple minutes for questions. So I know that you all may know nothing about relying on an external IRB, but I'm happy to entertain any questions if you have, just questions about when IRB review would be needed, or if you want to know more about the IRB. Yeah, 12 more minutes. I'm happy to engage you in discussion. Yeah.
Is this policy like useful for like any kind of engineering? Because I feel like I'm still like lost.
Yeah. So the policy in particular, so again, the policy only applies to NIH conducted or funded studies that involve that multi-site, model. However, the model for single IRB review could be widely applicable. So for instance, we have a study right now that involves several different institutions who are security, going to feed people avocados and do several measures with them. And they are conducting that same protocol at multiple sites. And our site and actually the College of Medicine and the Medical Center happen to be one of additional sites in that particular study. And so they came to us and said, hey, you know, we are not funded by NIH. We're funded by whomever, or not funded, or whatever the situation is. But we really like this model. We'd like to use this, and we'd like for the lead PI's institution to serve as the IRB of record. So we looked at the protocol that they had at the time and the materials that were available to us. And this is where, again, on a case-by-case basis, we can decide that we can seed review to another IRB. So in this case, we did say, yep, we think that's a great idea. Again, to reduce burdens for those 5 or 6 institutions that are participating in that study. And hopefully we're able then to cut down on the amount of work that the investigators have to do. And then we can appropriately advise them, because they've engaged us early in the process, as to what they need to do here at Penn State with regard to all those other things that need to happen. So in engineering, I guess the question is, the answer is, it depends. It depends if you have a project that you're just conducting here at Penn State with human participants or human subjects, or if you have a project that is going to be conducted more broadly at multiple sites.
I would say we're seeing a lot more human subject research from the College of Engineering, especially biomedical engineering, and sometimes computer engineering when you might be looking at like big data or things like that. So we're seeing a lot more human subject research from the college.
Follow that human subject research. Would it affect the policy differ in the sense when we do a human subject research, it affects the humans and maybe physically, emotionally, or well, not in a bad way, but it does make a change to the human overall environment. So would this policy differ in that sense, or I understand it will have all these.
I would say what's most affected by risk level or by the types of activities that they're engaging in, what's most affected by that is the decision on who will really service the reviewing IRB. So I think the advantage to this is we are obviously not a medical center. So if we were to have a study that is heavily biomedically based, or maybe just something that our IRB is not used to reviewing, we don't have expertise in that area, so we tend to load our IRB with members who have expertise in the areas that we typically see or review. And when needed, we pull in consultants who have other expertise to provide information to the IRB that they can use in their review. We also have some alternative IRB members who can also kind of sub in for the regular members who have particular types of expertise as well. And so in that arena, I would say that one advantage could be that if we had a study in engineering where they were creating a new medical device or something, and we don't have maybe as much expertise in reviewing that in our IRB, we could possibly seed review to another participating IRB that has more experience in that area, or that regularly does these sort of things. And we do encounter that from time to time here at our site, because we have some departments or some areas and departments that dabble in research that is just not common across the whole university. And so, those are the ones where we receive it and we go, okay, what do I do with this one? You feel like sometimes you're starting from square one and trying to pull in that expertise. So I think this is one of the advantages of this model. Kind of have more people at your disposal, more IRBs at your disposal. Any other questions? Anything else you want to know about IRB?
From the study from the College of Engineering.
Which department?
Okay.
I was just curious, which department? But I know that I see more.
I was going to say, Jenny, what types of projects have you received?
I see more recently get from engineering design a lot of. And
Sometimes AE, architectural
Yeah.
engineering, lighting, like sometimes they'll do surveys with people. And those are the things where sometimes engineers can get like caught because they didn't realize that what they did needed IRB approval. So hopefully you all have great advisors, faculty advisors who'd be able to advise you as to whether IRB approval would be needed or not. But sometimes those are the partners where we don't frequently see human research, and so they tend to miss the cases sometimes that are, I don't want to use the word obvious, but just, they're surveying people, and they're going to publish that or something, and they didn't realize that they needed IRB approval for that or something. So.
Some pretty interesting work on engineering. Keeping us on our toes. But I mean, especially the biomedical engineering stuff, because I think a lot of it is, it's their first foray into human subject research, and and then a lot of times it could be FDA regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, it could be a medical device, and so then we have those regulations to put in play, and so it can be tricky, but that's what these are.
Anything else for Sarah?
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks for having me.